Of that. Yes, here we go, right. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you very much to Tom, who I know has put a lot of work into organising this event, and I'm very grateful for that. President, Provost, colleagues, friends, before in the hour or two that's preceded this, there's been a very gracious hospitality provided by the university, which I have to say, welcome as it is, it strikes me as somewhat imprudent. Whether you really want to give your lecturer access to alcohol before they have to give a lecture is a further matter. It's been said, I think actually, President, you said that I was visiting Baylor for a term, or for a semester rather. This is going to come as rather bad news to those who think they've signed me on in perpetuity, or at least till the grave opens up for me. But one thing, you might think, well, if you get to Baylor, that wouldn't be a problem. I mean, serving alcohol beforehand. But and that is true, but colleagues at Baylor have ways of negotiating the subsequent period following a lecture. I'm sure you know that with Pope Francis here in the United States, the Pope's great concern with the issue of mutual recognition. Pope Francis thinks that many of the troubles in the world today are to do with the failure of one group to fully recognize and have respect for the dignity of another, whether it be one Christian denomination for another or one faith group for another, and so on. But it's well known that that Baptists have difficulty recognizing one another in a liquor store. However, having said that, I am very grateful. It's been very interesting, actually, in the opportunity we were provided with the hospitality that preceded this. I had an opportunity to speak with your president, and it turns out that we have mutual interests in the question of tactical and strategic defence. Some years ago, I used to know quite well somebody called Sir Michael Quinlan, who was the permanent secretary at the Ministry of Defence, a civil servant, who was instrumental, actually, in persuading the British government to disavow the use of tactical nuclear weapons. So we got rid of our nuclear depth charges and artillery pieces and so on. But we had an exceedingly interesting discussion. But no sooner had that ended, but that I met with your provost, and he was telling me that he was a graduate of the Juilliard School. And I was explaining that my mother was a choreographer, and most of my mother's family are involved in one way or another in theatre or television or film and so on. And I was explaining, and I said, I don't know whether this name is known to you, but one of my cousin's daughters was for a couple of years was the girlfriend, shall we put it that way, of a British actor, Dominic Cumberbatch. But I gather that he's not unknown in this part of the world. And he's a very nice boy too. We're very sorry that broke up. So let me begin by saying, actually, one, this is a technical question. Do I have any way of advancing from one image to another? Do I have a clicker? Oh, I do. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's fine. So can I just check, first of all, that this is not my talk to midwives in Waco? Let's just run through this. No, we're fine. Yeah, okay, that's fine. It's just you might be a little perplexed by some of the images of it. Anyway, well, there are serious issues, ethical and practical, to be discussed about breech birth. But anyway, we're not going to deal with that. Let me begin by saying this, which I don't think I've yet had an opportunity really to explain, but I feel a particular affection and a debt to this university, and this is why. I had been appointed to St Andrews in 1983, and in 87, 88, I went to the University of Pittsburgh at the invitation of the then director of the Center for History and Philosophy of Science, a very well-known American philosopher of science, Adolf Grunbaum, and we spent time there. But the first talk I ever gave, subsequent to being a graduate student, was at the University of Pittsburgh, which was fitting since they'd appointed me. But the second talk I ever gave was in the Center for Thomistic Studies here in Houston, Texas, and the circumstance of that I should like to, if I may, explain to you. So here you see a sort of an aggregation of images. We have on the left-hand side the famous encyclical Aeterni Patris, in which the Pope of the period, towards the end of the 19th century, Leo XIII, addressed the Universal Church and commended, in the context of that, the study of the philosophy of the Middle Ages, but in particular the philosophy of the philosophical and theological ideas of Thomas Aquinas. And in fact, he directed Catholic institutions to have St. Thomas as their patron. And as you see, this is titled or subtitled On the Restoration of Christian Philosophy. Well, the next image over, some of you will recognize, I suppose, and that is Victor Brezek, who was the co-founder with Hugh Roy Marshall, I think, of the Center for Thomistic Studies here at the university. It was a kind of offshoot of the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies. Victor Brezek edited a set of essays, which was the first in a series called Thomistic Papers, and that was published in 1985. The editor of a prominent analytical philosophical journal, Philosophical Books, which was simply a reviews journal, knew of my interest in Aquinas, and he said to me, well, from time to time we get these kind of oddball books in, and we don't generally review them, but there's one here, do you want to have a look at it, and so on. He said, well, you can just have it, I don't expect you to review it. But at any rate, I read it, and it was this book, this collection of essays, Thomistic Papers, and I did review it, and that review was published in Philosophical Books in 1986. The collection of essays had been published in 1985, and I'll come in a moment to, well, maybe I'll do that now, actually, this was the concluding paragraph of that review, published in 1986. I wouldn't hold to every word that I wrote then, but at any rate, most of the leading proponents of Thomism I wrote in 1986. Most of the leading proponents of Thomism are middle-aged or older and learnt their philosophy in a period when the external and intellectual environment was hostile to it. Isolation also inhibits development, and there's a tendency among Thomists to rest content with quoting Aquinas in connection with an issue rather than engaging in original philosophical research. A little ungenerous, I realize, but anyway. all this said, the present collection provides a useful opportunity to learn something of modern American Thomism, and it's to be hoped that the result may be that in return neo-scholasticism is able to attract the interest of young analytical philosophers who can bring to it the critical power, inventiveness, and rigor of their own intellectual tradition. At any rate, having written and published this review, I then sent it to the then director of the Center for Thomistic Studies, thinking he might be interested. In fact, I may have addressed it to Victor Brezek himself, but at any rate, he passed it on to the person who was then the director, and that was Father Leonard Kennedy, who we see here, and some of you, I'm sure, will remember Father Kennedy, a Canadian Basilian. And Father Kennedy was very gracious to say that if I were to be in the United States, he'd be very pleased if I were able to come down and speak and sort of, I suppose, sort of, face people with the words I'd written, and maybe that was what he had in mind. But at any rate, I did that, and that was in 1988. And my wife, Hilda, who's with me tonight, she and I had a very pleasant visit here. And of the people who were here then, certainly John Canassis, who I was seeing earlier on, John was one of those. Yes, there he was there, yes. And his wife, who I think was then the secretary, is that right? Yeah. And we had a very enjoyable visit then and met people, and it was, for me, very educative and so on. So, but not only that, actually, that subsequently I sort of felt that really, having offered these remarks in the context of that review, that really I ought to try to, myself at any rate, to some degree, to take on the task or to take up something that I himself was proposing, and so to try to think about ways in which one might systematically try to integrate or synthesize some of the methodological approaches associated with analytical philosophy and some of the substantial metaphysical and other claims that had been advanced within the Thomistic tradition. And I began to do that in a series of essays and so on. And on the strength of these essays, Alistair MacIntyre, who at that point was at the University of Notre Dame, which of course where he is now, but he had a MacIntyrean interlude in between. But at any rate, Alistair MacIntyre said, look, would you come and give some, this seems quite interesting, would you come and give some lectures in Notre Dame? And that I did, I think, in 1992. And he said, what's the title of these lectures? And I think I said it was something like From Nature to Nature. And he looked and so on. And it has to be said about Alistair MacIntyre, he sometimes sort of exudes or gives a sense of a certain forbidding temperament. But in fact, he's a fairly acute publicist. And really, if you were in the entertainment business, perhaps, he wouldn't be a bad man to have as your agent. Anyway, he said, no, I don't think so. I think we can do better than that. So anyway, we had a little chat. Anyway, I said, well, look, all right, here we go. Okay, fair enough. All right. Why don't we call them Analytical Thomism? And in that moment, in 1992, at the University of Notre Dame, was born an expression which is now a Wikipedia article. It's an entry in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and so on and such like. And we even see that there are books called Analytical Thomism, Traditions in Dialogue. And so in a way, I think that to the extent that I've come to be associated with that expression, I at least can claim to be literally the author of that expression. But at any rate, to the extent that I've come to be associated with that expression and the idea that it represents, it probably had its origins here in Houston, Texas, in 1988. So I'm delighted to be back and to pay that tribute. And if sobriety can keep me going, I may even have something to say about the substance of the lecture. So anyway, but that is, so that's a little bit of history that I thought you might be interested in. There is, by the way, I'll just say two things about this actually. There is a history of the Center for Thomistic Studies, and I hope that I think it's available via the web page, but I think it would be really worth, it's dated to 2012, but I think it would be well worth sort of updating that and making it available as a little publication and so on, and perhaps at the American Catholic Philosophical Association and other occasions making that available, because I do think that the work that has been done here over the years and the example that has been provided really is extremely important and very valuable and much appreciated. I think very good things have come out along the way, particular things and so on, but above and beyond that, I think the very existence of something bearing the title, the Center for Thomistic Studies, I think has been a great encouragement to many of us, particularly I think for people in the United States, but also beyond that. So it's a great, I really do want to pay that tribute to directors present and past. These things are never kind of smooth roads and so on. There'll be little bumps along the way, but I do think it's extremely important, and I do hope President of the University, Provost, will continue to appreciate the value of that and, to put it brutally, speak to your donors about reinforcing it materially as well as intellectually and spiritually. At any rate, there we are. So, I haven't finished. I am, by the way, coming from a part of the world in which buildings continued to be fortified well into the end of the 19th century. In Scotland, you really couldn't trust your neighbours. So if you wanted to have a secure house, it really had to be fortified. I am rather struck by the fact, which I've never seen in my life before, there is a moat here between the space that the lecturer occupies. And I can only assume that, like a James Bond film or something like that, sort of sulfuric acid floods into here if there's any danger of the lecturer becoming a subject of attack. So I'm trusting the provost has the button that has to be pressed if I say the wrong thing, or indeed, for that matter, if I go on too long. I did assure him before I began speaking that I would certainly not go beyond 3 hours. So you're all right. So let's just check where we are. We're going to. I'm going to be obviously saying something about Thomas Aquinas. It'd be a rather poor occasion if Thomas didn't get a mention. But I'm going to be talking about these two figures because, although I said that it is true that this phrase analytical Thomism is one that I probably ought to have copyrighted, but Henry didn't manage to do so. Incidentally, I happen to know the man Jim Goodfellow, not a name that is well known in the world, who is who created the 4-figure PIN number. You know, when you go to an ATM machine and you put your card in and so on, you have to put a 4-figure in. I know Jim Goodfellow quite well, and I said to him, drink had been taken. I said to him, so how much did you earn? And he said £1,000. The company that he worked for paid him £1,000 for the invention of the 4-figure PIN number. Can you imagine if he'd sort of, had just 1% of use or something of that sort? Anyway, I didn't even get $1 for the invention of analytical Thomism. But anyway, the point here is that I want in this context to make tribute, really. I mean, if I made any contribution, it was 2 words. But really the sources, I would say, and I know that here Christopher Martin is here, who knew these 2 individuals better than I, but really the source of it, my inspiration, I think for many of us really, were Peter Geach and Elizabeth Anscombe. And I'm going to say a little bit about them, not so much about them personally, but a little bit about their intellectual ideas, particularly as they bear upon this question of the mind and the soul. But we'll get to that. So here's the question to begin with. When Christopher was a student, and when I was a student in philosophy in Britain, and this would be true of many people here in the United States, so we're talking about, I suppose, the mid to late 1970s, early 1980s, and so on. You could really partition philosophy students, undergraduate philosophy students, into 2 camps. Those who would be perceived to be intellectually engaged and ambitious, and those, as John Stuart Mill once said, the wise and the otherwise. And the wise really studied philosophy of language and philosophy of mind. I mean, by the period of the mid-1970s, a little later, really the core of analytical philosophy was the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind. And everything else was to be spun out of that to the extent that everything else needed consideration. Pretty much every significant philosophical issue could be resolved into an issue within the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind. Now, that has changed considerably, but at any rate, it still remains the case that the philosophy of mind in particular is a central area of concern among Anglo-American philosophers in well, I sometimes say the analytical tradition, and then my Thomist friends say, no, that's not a tradition. No, that's not, they're not allowed the word tradition, anyway. But at any rate, here in Wallace Maitson in 1966, in an essay, he says something rather interesting. Because the point is that analytical philosophy of mind since 1975 or thereabouts, so what's that, 40 years, I suppose, 75, 85, 95, 2000, 40 years. For the last 40 years has been rather preoccupied with a central question, which is the question of reductionism, the question as to whether or not it's possible to account for all mental phenomena in, broadly speaking, materialistic terms. And in 1966, in an essay published in a collection, Wallace Maitson says something rather interesting. So let's hear what he has to say. It's just this. He says the Greeks did... Sorry, there should be a knot in there. Sorry about that. I can't even use the excuse of the alcohol before the lecture. But anyway, yeah. Maybe I can use the excuse of the alcohol before the lecture. The Greeks did not lack a concept of mind, even of a mind separable from the body. But from Homer to Aristotle, the line between mind and body, when drawn at all, was drawn so as to put the processes of sense perception on the side of the body. Indeed, in the whole classical corpus, there exists no denial of the view that sensing is a bodily process throughout. Now, I don't want to get into a sort of technical exegetical question. There is an issue as to whether or not what Mateson says there is exactly true. For example, one figure, Plotinus, does seem to think that sense perception presents a problem for materialism, to do with reflexivity, to do with the fact that you are aware not only of seeing, but of the fact that you are seeing, not only aware of the objects of perception, but of the fact that you are perceiving them. But broadly speaking, he's onto something here. The Greeks didn't lack a concept of mind, but they drew the line somewhere differently. I say somewhere differently to where it's drawn by analytical philosophers from the period I'm talking about, the 1970s, because it's very common to hear it said today, even among materialists, that the problem for materialism, for physicalism, is the problem of consciousness and perception, experiential side of mind. And here's an illustration of that. Galen Strawson, the son of the great British philosopher Sir Peter Strawson, writes, "The existence of experience is the only hard part of the mind-body problem for materialists. The things we think of as higher intellectual achievements are just not a philosophical problem, except insofar as they involve a capacity for experience." So what we've got here is Wallace Mateson saying that among the ancients, and we could extend this to the medievals, among the pre-moderns, if you like, they did draw a distinction. It wasn't that they lacked a concept of mind, but the concept of mind that they were focused on, or was central to this, was the notion of intellect, not the notion of conscious experience. Conscious experience, roughly speaking, they were happy to give over to biology or physiology or the science of material bodies, living material bodies, but that the thing that they thought was resistant, was separable, distinct, was intellect, whereas what we have Galen Strawson saying is exactly the opposite, that intellect, these higher intellectual functions, they're not problematic for materialism because there are particular materialist theories of particularly something called functionalism and so on, but the thing that's really difficult is experience. So the medievals find experience unproblematic from the question of materialism and immaterialism and non-materialism and so on, and the moderns find consciousness as being problematic. Now that is a kind of starting point and something rather interesting to note, I think. Now, people talk about the mind-body problem or the mind-body question. So the first thing I want to say is, rather, I suppose, in the spirit of Thomas, to draw some distinctions. On the one hand, it depends what you mean, and so on and such like. Now, I think that the mind-body question or the mind-body problem isn't really one question, and it may not even concern one entity, but we'll leave the entity for the moment. It's not one question, but it's many questions. I think there are a series of philosophically challenging questions that kind of get confused or bundled together or simply haven't been separated. People have not recognized that there are these different aspects. There is what I'll just call the consciousness matter problem, and that's the modern problem, if you like. That's what Galen Strawson has in mind when he says that experience is the big problem for materialism, trying to account for consciousness. Great English philosopher John Locke asks himself the question, what would God have to do to make a block of wood conscious? You know, here's a piece of wood, a lectern, and so on. What would God have to do to make this thing conscious? And really the question there, I suppose, that he's trying to get at is this. Could God simply add consciousness to this? So as well as its shape and its size and its density and its weight and so on, could God just say, well, look, here's another thing. It's conscious. Or Locke wondered, would it be necessary in order to make this thing conscious that God changed it in some other way? In other words, that consciousness is not just a brute add-on, that it would have to be an emergent or a supervenient or a consequent or whatever term you want to use, that in order to make this conscious, God would have to do something else to it. Now, the advocates of modern sort of neo-dualism are inclined to think, I mean, they wouldn't put it this way, of course, because they wouldn't speak of God, but they think God could just add consciousness. Whereas the Aristotelians, broadly speaking, are going to have to say, no, God would have to change the physiology or the physical construction of this in order to make it conscious. And that, of course, is already a clue to the fact that they think that consciousness is somehow intimately connected with the physical structure and organization of things. Anyway, there's the conscious, let's just call it the consciousness matter problem. What's the relationship between something's being conscious and its being a material object? Then there's a second question, which I think is a distinct question, which is the agent-body problem. And that roughly is this question, the great Austrian stroke British philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein poses in his writings the question, or a sort of a mathematical challenge in a way. He says, I raise my arm goes up, what's the difference? What's the difference between my arm merely going up and me raising my arm? And so you might think of that as being the agent-body question. What is the difference between a mere bodily movement and an action? What is added to bodily movement in the circumstance in which that bodily movement is also an action? And then the third issue, I think, is what I'm calling here the perception-sensation question or problem. What's the relationship between your sense organs, let's say in the case of sight, your eyes being irradiated by light, or perhaps in the case of touch, there being certain pressure on the surface of the skin, and so on through the different senses. What's the relationship between these changes in the body and your perceiving things? So what's the relationship between the sensation that I'm currently having as I grip the side of this and my sense of this, of the shape and figure of this thing, and so on? Then there's a fourth question, which I'll call the nous matter question. And this is the question that really the medievals and the Greeks are concerned with. What is the question of what is the relationship between intellect? I'll say a little bit more about that later on. What's the relationship between intellect, not sensation, not experience, but something like abstract thought and matter? So, for example, we need to draw a distinction between numerals and numbers. So I could inscribe on a piece of paper, or I could express vocally and so on, certain numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. What's the relationship between those numerals, those inscribed, these instances of spoken or written words and so on? What's the relationship between those and numbers, the things that those represent? What's the relationship between the numeral 1 and the number 1, the numeral 2 and the number 2, and so on? And in particular, what's the relationship between me uttering the words 2 plus 2 equals 4 and me having the thought 2 plus 2 equals 4? The thought 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not a thought about numerals, it's a thought about numbers. I'm not concerned with these token inscriptions, I'm concerned with the things they represent, the numbers themselves, so abstract thought. And then a fifth problem, lots of problems, no solutions tonight, lots of problems. The fifth problem is the power event question. I'm going to call it the power event question. What is the relationship between me having the ability to, say, perform fairly elementary multiplication and me saying on a given occasion 2 times 2 equals 4 or 2 times 3 equals 6 and so on? It looks like the power, the ability, is not exhausted by any particular instance of its exercise. So if I've got the capacity to multiply numbers, let's say whole numbers, no particular occasion of the exercise of that capacity amounts to the totality of the capacity. The capacity seems in some way to be transcendent of its exercises. It's above and beyond, it's more than its exercises. So what's the relationship between my ability to calculate and some particular occasion on which I do so? And then another issue or question is the evolution-emergence question. I'm going to take it as being, let's say, a widely shared view that there was a time in the history of the universe when there were no created minds. I won't say there were no minds, my divine minds, spiritual creatures and so on, but leave those to one side. Let's just take the material universe. I take it that it's pretty much uncontroversial that there was a time when there were no thinking things, and now there are thinking things. So how do you get from a universe in which there is no thought to a universe in which there is thought? Now, I myself think this is a much more fundamental philosophical problem than has really been acknowledged. In fact, I think that there really are only two possibilities, two ways of trying to bridge that gap, really. One is by saying it doesn't exist. That's to say, there never was a time when the universe didn't have thinking things in it. And that really is panpsychism. It's to say that in some sense the material universe was already thinking in some primitive, primordial way. The great American thinker William James talked about mind dust being sprinkled through the cosmos. So maybe it always was the case that there was thought, however primitive, and that what we think of as developed thought is just the aggregation of mind dust. So we are aggregations of mind dust. That's one possibility. And the other possibility is superaddition. That's to say that thought was added to the material universe. It didn't exist before. It does exist now. You can't get it out of non-thinking stuff, and so it has to be a superaddition. And that's my own view. In fact, I think that the existence of thinking creatures is an indirect proof of the existence of God, or a prime thinker, that you can't get thought out of non-thinking things, so either you have to be a panpsychist or you have to be a superadditionalist. And if you're a superadditionalist, I think that you have to see that superaddition as deriving from the work of something that is itself a mind, and so you get something like universal nous or mind. That may not be a personal God, of course, that's another matter. And then we've got the mind-soul-body question, and that's the one I'm going to say a little bit more about as we proceed, in particular in relation to Anscombe and Geach. So I said it was going to be 3 hours, all right? That's okay. Now, if anybody else leaves here in the next 2 hours... No, close the doors. So, first thoughts from Aquinas. So in the Summa, Thomas writes, this is Prima Pars, question 75, articles 2 and 5. He says, it must necessarily be allowed that the principle of intellectual operation, the thing that is responsible for our intellectual activity, which we call the soul of man, is a principle both incorporeal, non-material, and subsistent, something that exists in its own activity. For it is clear that by means of intellect, man can know all corporeal things, all bodily things. That isn't fully the argument, that's just a sort of brief extract. I'll come to a generalized form of his argument in a minute. And then another, in Article 2, he says, the soul has no matter. We may proceed from the specific notion of the human soul inasmuch as it is intellectual. Remember, it says intellectual again. He's not talking about the sensory experience stuff. He's talking about thought, intellection, abstract thought. For it's clear that whatever is received into something is received according to the condition of the recipient. Whatever is received according to the mode of the recipient. Now, a thing is known insofar as its form is in the knower, but the intellectual soul knows a thing in its nature absolutely. I'll explain that in a second. Therefore, the intellectual soul itself is an absolute form and not something composed of matter and form. It follows, therefore, that the intellectual soul and every intellectual substance which has knowledge of forms absolutely is exempt from composition of matter and form. So let's just explain briefly what he means by absolutely here. He's distinguishing between, let's say, I can't really, but if I were to draw a little triangle on the board or on the wall here, I could draw your attention to that triangle. And if I were to draw another triangle, I could draw your attention to that triangle. One might be isosceles, one might be right-angled, and so on. They might be large, they might be small. They might be drawn in red, they might be coloured in, and so on. All these different individual triangles. But what, as well as attending experientially through observation and so on to these particular triangles, we can also, at the level of intellect, consider what it is to be a triangle per se, as such. Not this triangle, not that triangle, not of this shape, not of this size, not of, and so on and such like, but triangularity as such, and that's what he means by absolutely. So, as it were, the sense knows this triangle, that triangle, but the intellect can understand triangularity as such, and that's what he means by absolutely. Now, he thinks that this capacity of intellect to know the natures of things per se, as such, indicates the immateriality or the non-materiality of the power by which those things are known. And I concur with that, I agree with that. So let's just give a generalized form of Thomas's argument. This is not not meant to be a formalization of the thing I've just quoted, but a more generalized form of things based on different arguments that he gives in the Summa and his commentary on the, not his commentary on the Anima, but the disputed questions on the De Anima. So we've got something like this is a form of argument. Thought is essentially constituted by the exercise of concepts. What it is to be thinking, as in contrast, say, to experiencing or looking at something or hearing something or smelling something and so on. I mean, animals smell, hear, touch, and so on, not non-human, non-rational animals. But thought is essentially constituted by the exercise of concepts, these general ideas. Cats don't think about triangles as such. A cat might respond to a triangle, say on the front of a packet of food or something of that sort, but cats don't think about triangles as such. I say this is a very difficult fact for me to contemplate because at one point we had 6 cats and I think since this is not, it is being recorded, I can't say that, right? I can't say that I love my cats more than my children, or I can't say that, so that's fine. But let's just say cats are very close to us. But nonetheless, I would have to accept that however dim my children were at an earlier stage, they can think about triangles, and however wonderful the cats are, they can't. So that's the fact. So thought is essentially constituted by the exercise of concepts. Concepts are universals. They're ways of representing things at a universal level. No materially instantiated property is universal. Therefore, the occurrence of concepts in thought can't involve their material instantiation. What is essentially constituted by elements that occur non-materially is itself non-material. Therefore, thought is non-material. Thought is the activity of an agent. Acting follows upon being. Therefore, the agent of thought, the thinker, is non-material. Now, this argument, as I put it up there, does not occur in Aquinas, just put like that, but this draws upon different things that Thomas says and is certainly consonant with, and I would contend with textual support, is something that Thomas does indeed argue for. It's just it's kind of distributed a bit. At any rate, now, I want to, first of all, say that I agree with this. I mean, this argument, I think, is valid. It's certainly valid. And I think that the premises are true. But, of course, there can be discussion about that. May I just at this point intrude something more general, by the way, which I would offer as a bit of, as an observation, a bit of advice to Christians generally, but to Catholics in particular, which is that often in debating issues around abortion, say, or same-sex marriage, or the existence of God, or whatever else it may be, I do think that often we unknowingly operate with a conception of argument that is no longer tenable. I'm not talking about the particular arguments, I mean the conception of what argument is. And the conception of argument with which we operate that is no longer tenable is that of demonstration. So the medievals believed in demonstration. That is to say, they believed in proceeding by deductive inference from self-evident principles. And so since the premises are certain, are known with certainty because they're self-evident, then, and if you proceed deductively, then the conclusion inherits the certainty of the premises. I think that one thing that the 20th century has taught us, this is not a sociological observation, it's a philosophical observation, is there are no self-evident premises. There are no self-evident premises. There is no premise that is self-evident. That recognition, I think, has come in a variety of ways. One of the most powerful and potent sources of it was the great American logician Quine, who really taught us, I think, there's just no going back on this in my view, he just taught us that any proposition can be defended as long as you're willing to make enough adjustments across the fabric of the web of belief. There are no self-evident premises. Now, this is not really a 20th century discovery. And if you want another instance of it, it was when the great Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid discovered that parallel lines could meet. Right? It just seemed self-evident that you could not have, that there was definitional for parallel lines, that they don't meet. But there are geometries in which parallel lines meet. So I think what we have to accept is that there are no self-evident premises. What there are plausible premises, reasonable premises. And so if we're engaged in argument around, say, same-sex marriage or abortion and so on, what we have to argue for is plausibility in the light of total experience or total reflection. But there are no, so I'm going to just assert this, I'm afraid now, there are no self-evident principles. People who think that abortion is okay, or people who think that same-sex marriage is okay, may be stupid, but they may not be stupid. They may be people who have a different conception of the relevant premises. And I think that often we have put ourselves into a difficult position, I believe, by thinking that this is a kind of zero-sum game. It's either victory or defeat. And I'm afraid that the sociological upshot of that is that we have been defeated. I think had we been more humble, more intellectually modest, and recognized that there are reasonable arguments in favor of abortion, there are reasonable arguments in favor of same-sex marriage, and for all of these controversial issues, then I think we would have done better, because we would have recognized that what we needed to do was not produce the killer argument from self-evident principles that could not be disputed by deduction, and show that therefore anybody who didn't embrace that conclusion was stupid or wicked and so on. Now, when I say there are reasonable arguments, I'm not endorsing those arguments, right? This is not relativism. What I'm trying to say is that I think what we have to recognize is that we need to work harder to try to establish the premises of our arguments by trying to propose and defend them in the light of what I just think of as total plausibility. And that is as much a rhetorical task as it is a dialectical task. We don't need more information, we need more imagination. We need to try to persuade our opponents around these issues to conceive of things differently. But we cannot show, and we will not be able to show, that what they think is simply demonstrably false. Because there are no demonstrations. Demonstration is over. It's even over in mathematics. There are no proofs that take the form of proceeding from self-evident premises deductively to certain conclusions. And the reason for that is there are no self-evident premises. I think that is a burden a shared human burden, that we have to sort of operate within the framework of that. Now, having said all of that, because you might sort of think, my goodness, what's he said all this? Well, I'm not dissenting from, I've argued publicly in print, on radio and so on against same-sex marriage. I've argued against abortion. I've argued for the non-materiality of the human mind and so on. But I don't think that these arguments can take the form of demonstrations, things that somebody simply are irrefutable in the face of. I think that they're plausibility arguments. They're arguments, all things considered. And as I say, I think that the all things considered argument needs to engage the imaginations of people, invoke their aesthetic experience and other things as well. Anyway, now I want to turn now to the sources briefly of Analytical Thomism, Elizabeth Anscombe and Peter Geach. To some people here, these will be well-known names, and their work will be known to you. In fact, I have with me the proofs of the 4th volume of collected writings of Elizabeth Anscombe that will be published in November on logic, truth, and meaning. I have no doubt whatsoever that Elizabeth Anscombe was one of the most powerful philosophers, intellectually powerful philosophers of the 20th century. I think that history will judge her increasingly well. Part of the reason why I think that she has not received the degree of recognition that her work merits, partly her advocacy of Catholic, her defense of Catholic faith and morals, partly temperamental, but partly the sheer difficulty of her work. Her work just is very difficult. Anybody who's read that work will know how difficult it is. There are no concessions made. Wittgenstein, who was her teacher, said to another student, his advice to that person was, go the bloody hard way. And having gone the hard way, don't simplify it. Don't give a summary that makes it easy. That everybody has to make that journey themselves intellectually. And Anscombe certainly, in all her writings, certainly didn't take the line, well, I've been thinking about this for a very long time, and let me just summarize my conclusions. No, she just gave you it. And you have to follow her on that journey through the hard way. Her husband, Peter Geach, by contrast, was a master prose stylist. I think if somebody were putting together an anthology of English prose from the 20th century, Peter Geach could very easily be considered for inclusion in that. He was a wonderful prose stylist. He was a student of prose. I mean, he read and appreciated the prose of others, obviously classical authors, but in particular I've just mentioned Dr. Johnson and G.K. Chesterton as authors whose work he studied and appreciated. And he was himself a great prose stylist. His great contributions philosophically, however, lie in the sphere of logic. Not so much formal logic, which of course he did, but philosophical logic, thinking about notions like truth, entailment, inference, identity, and so on. But I think that for all his many gifts, and he himself would have, in fact, I think did say this, that really the more creative of the two was Elizabeth Anscombe. I think he was genuinely the more creative philosopher. And I think, like her master Wittgenstein, it will take a long time for us to understand some of the things that she was saying. I mean, I think that people will be reading Anscombe in 30 years and 40 and 50 years' time and suddenly understand or get the hang of something that she was saying. Now, by the way, that's a sheer advert. This is the four volumes of her writings, and Logic, Truth and Meaning will appear in November, and that's, if anybody's interested, St. Salvatus Quad in St. Andrews. Right, Anscombe and Geach. They did two pieces of work together. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to speed this up now. By the way, I include these two photographs of Elizabeth Anscombe either side of the photograph of the two of them together to see, wasn't she stunning? I mean, very sort of engaging face as a young woman, very striking. The novelist Iris Murdoch was deeply in love with Anscombe. This was a love that was not reciprocated. I don't mean by that, let me make that clear. What I mean is that it was not expressed or realized or whatever it was. Iris Murdoch did have a series of female lovers, but Elizabeth Anscombe was not one of them. She was a very striking woman. At any rate, Anscombe and Geach largely worked independently of one another, and this is something that really does strike people as a little odd. I mean, you'd think that this married couple working together, I mean, living together, having their children together and one thing or another, you'd think that they discussed philosophy with one another. Actually, much less than you might suppose. There are two publications, however, that are, in one sense, co-publications. One is 1954, translations of Descartes, and the second is a set of essays called Three Philosophers, Aristotle, Aquinas, and Frege. The source of the latter, the Three Philosophers, these were encyclopedia articles that were commissioned and rejected. So they were invited to write individually encyclopedia articles on Aristotle, Aquinas, and Frege, and then the editor of the encyclopedia, whose name I won't mention here, but it's a well-known multi-volume encyclopedia of philosophy that's only recently been superseded by the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy. That editor then decided that these were not, didn't quite fit the bill. At any rate, and those in that volume, Three Philosophers, Anscombe is the author of the Aristotle essay, and they're not identified in the book. Anscombe is the author of the Aristotle essay, and Geach is the author of the Aquinas and Frege essays. But the other thing, and this is what I want to focus on, the other and earlier publication is a translation of Descartes, selections from the writings of Descartes. I have to say I have a proprietorial interest in this because until relatively recently, the standard translation of Descartes was the Haldane-Ross translation of Descartes by Elizabeth Haldane and G.H.R. Ross. And there is a descendant of Ross, a philosopher at the University of Leeds, and he and I at one point conspired to write an article on some aspect of Descartes. I should explain, by the way, that the Haldane and Ross translations were done in the period of the First World War or sometime like that, early part of the 20th century. And we were going to publish an article that would begin, as we were saying, but we never got around to doing that. At any rate, but the more recent publication, the edition of Descartes that has become standard is the Cottingham and others, a translation of Descartes. But in between times, there's this rather interesting translation that's not much used, actually, which is the Anscombe and Geach translation. Now, most of the work of this was done by Peter Geach, but I want to just draw your attention to a passage in the introduction to this set of translations, and it's this. They write, which is really to say, Peter Geach wrote, the most problem... Difficult? Let's try difficult, yeah. The most difficult problem, the most colourful, the most difficult problem of a Descartes translation is the rendering of the verbs cogitare and penser and their derivatives. Since Locke, the traditional English renderings have been the verb think and the noun thought. They should have quotes around them. We have decided to abandon this tradition. Okay, it could be worse, believe me, right? We have decided to abandon this tradition, which seems to us to run. Okay, we'll start this again, all right. The most difficult problem of a Descartes translation is the rendering of the verbs cogitare and penser and their derivatives. Since Locke, the traditional English renderings have been the verb, quotes, think, and the noun, quotes, thought. We have decided to abandon this tradition, which seems to us to run the risk of seriously misrepresenting what Descartes says. He defines the words as applying not only to intellectual processes, but also to acts of will, passions, mental images, and even sensations. Now, I'm going to contend, I haven't done the scholarly work on this, and it would take a bit of time, I'm sure, but I'm going to contend that those remarks in the introduction to that translation are the source of what has become an orthodoxy subsequently. The orthodoxy represented by Wallace Mason and by others, that it is really only with Descartes that you get a transformation through an expansion of the mind from intellect to include sensory experience and so on and such like. And I think it was really, and the tribute here I think has to go to Peter Geach. I think it was Peter Geach who really first saw this and puts it in that introduction and translates accordingly. And this has become, as I say, something of a kind of orthodoxy, really. Cartesianism, the rise of Cartesianism. But look online, which is now the source to do this, and try to find the first occurrences of the term Cartesianism. I mean, modern occurrences of the term Cartesianism. And I think you'll find they all predate 1954, the occasion of the translation, the Anscombe and Geach translation. And really the point they're making here is that he's using think in a novel way. He's using think to extend to experience, something that no medieval author would have said or ancient author would have said. Now, Anscombe and Aquinas. So let me just say this. What did Anscombe think about Aquinas' proof for the non-materiality of the soul and for the survivability of that separable intellect? My estimation is that neither Peter Geach nor Elizabeth Anscombe would have subscribed to this belief were it not that Catholic faith requires it or seems to require it. Neither of them thought it was philosophically plausible. Neither of them thought that the arguments that Thomas provides do establish the idea of a separable intellectual soul. Now, Anscombe, insofar as it was possible, steered clear of discussing these matters. Geach does discuss them, but in ways that I think give evidence to his discomfort. And he was a very strong resurrectionist, both of them were. I mean, that's to say he believed that any possibility of future life turned on the possibility of bodily resurrection. But that really isn't the issue. The question is of the intermediary and the separable soul. And I think that both of them found great difficulty with the notion of the separable soul, and I think that Anscombe in particular found it intellectually incredible, not believable. I think that's one reason that she didn't discuss it. She didn't find that it was a credible position. And I say this, I mean, these are both people who converted to the Catholic faith and who were resolute defenders of Catholic teaching, but did not find philosophically compelling, at the very least, and I think in Anscombe's case, even credible, the idea that there was a separable intellectual soul. Now, towards the end of her life, she was interviewed on the matter, and you can see the discomfort, I think, in these words. This isn't the totality of the interview. So the interviewer says this: Thomas Aquinas also held that the spiritual nature of the soul seemed to him to be rational grounds for affirming the possibility of the soul's surviving death, sort of comment. She says, probably he did. I would say that to him it was a problem, and it's not clear that he solved the problem. I don't think I knew his writings on the subject well enough, I know his writings on the subject well enough to say, she's here being very discreet, she did know his writings on the subject very well indeed. I don't think that I know his writings on the subject well enough to say, but I would expect that he thought that he'd solved the problem. What I do note is that for him it was a problem, and that's the right approach to this matter, which should be a problem. And then the interviewer says, in your view, that is a problem? Would you say we cannot, without faith, affirm a life after death? Faith can affirm that, and I don't think it was faith on his part. I don't think you have to have faith to believe that the principle of unity of the human organism is a spiritual principle. But I do observe that the way in which many spiritualists talk upon the whole is a way which sees no more in the unity of the human organism than we would see in the unity of the bicycle. Now, I think the thing to notice about that reply is it's evasive. That wasn't the issue. The issue wasn't whether or not the principle of the unity of the human organism is a spiritual principle. That's the Aristotelian doctrine of the soul as the form of the body. The question was about the separability of the soul as a surviving element. Now, having said that, I disagree with Anscombe on this matter, but I just do want to flag up that she was a very great figure. I think the greatest Catholic philosopher of the 20th century. I think the greatest woman philosopher of whom we have any historical record. But I think that when it came to this, she really felt enormous difficulties and really felt that this was not a matter in which she was comfortable discussing because she felt that philosophy moved in the other direction. Now, I just want to end really with this. So what are the questions and what are the answers? Well, I think there's a set of, I know time is short, so I'm going to be very brief about this, but I think that, sorry, I really shouldn't touch the microphone. I should have learnt my lesson, right. Even better, it sounds as if I'm getting an electric shock every time I do that, but I'm not. Yeah. If I were, I wouldn't be touching it. The problem of substance and partial substance, the core of human non-materiality, the question of meaning, an inner process stands in need of an outward criterion, residual empiricism on the part of both Anscombe and Geach, Platonism or Aristotelianism, Aquinas the Platonist, Mysterianism, skepticism or recovering intellectual humility. Right, okay, so we've got about 2 minutes to finish this. So here's a conjecture. Anscombe and Geach, I'm citing them because they're philosophers whom I admire greatly. They're philosophers who contributed a great deal to the defense of the Catholic faith. They're philosophers whose general ideas I'm very much in sympathy with and appreciate and have learnt from and so on. But I do notice that they're struggling on this fundamental question. I mean, they're very, very far, 1 million miles away from anybody who thought they could give a demonstration of the existence and survival of the soul. But I think that they, like all of us, in a sense, are children of their times. I think that they were still working, and it sounds odd in a way to say this, and people who know their work might even be shocked by this, that I think they were still working within the climate of late empiricism. I think their great difficulty really was to try to see how you could fashion a concept of the soul as a possible separable being based on ordinary other concepts that we have. And I mean, this would need a lot more discussion, but let me just say this. They had different difficulties with the idea of the soul. In the case of Anscombe, the great difficulty was the idea of immaterial or non-material substance. She thought, with perhaps some plausibility, that the concept of substance had been introduced into Greek philosophy, and introduced into Western philosophy in general, to account for essentially what we would call physical change. That the concept of substance is what you're driven to if you're trying to understand fundamental change. So we can have change in accidents, the colour of things and so on, but we also get more fundamental kinds of change. And so we're looking for what the subject of change is in these circumstances, and we introduce the idea of a thing, a something. But that notion of a something is very much tied to understanding natural change, or observable change in life, in the world around us and so on. And Anscombe's great difficulty was to see how you could sustain the notion of a something independently of the sorts of characteristics and features that had been the ground for introducing the notion of a something in the first instance, of undergoing certain kinds of material changes. And she just really struggled with the idea that there could be a something that was not a material something, that was not a natural something in that sense. In the case of Geach, it was a different matter. He couldn't really see how you could attribute to such a thing characteristics such as thinking, experience, and so on, which he thought were tied very much to behavioral performances. So, I mean, of course, this is really, I suppose, has its inspiration in one hand on Aristotle, on the other hand on Wittgenstein, that only of something that is living can we say that it's doing something, that really it's, Wittgenstein asks, why can't we think of a stone as thinking? And his thought is, well, it's not doing anything, right? That sort of the notion of thought is very much tied up with the idea of activity, of a kind that is, manifest in the world and so on. And Wittgenstein has this wonderful remark. I have about 3 remarks that I sort of alternate between as being possible inscriptions on my grave. One is Hegel's remark in the preface to the Philosophy of Right, when philosophy paints its grey on grey, then as a form of life grown old, and by means of philosophy it cannot be rejuvenated. Which I think is a wonderful observation. But another one is an inner process stands in need of an outward criterion, Wittgenstein's remark. An inner process stands in need of an outward criterion. If we are to attribute to something an inner process, there has to be something that constitutes a mark of that process going on. This is not behaviorism. He's not reducing the inner process to the behavior, but he's saying in the absence of there being something that counts as engaging in that activity, then we have no ground for ascribing that activity. And he didn't see how we could ascribe activity to something that wasn't engaged in things like writing, talking, walking, moving, and so on and such like. Now, here's where I end up. I think that anybody who believes in the separable soul, I'm not going into the details of what a theory might be and so on, really, I think, has to go back a bit before Aristotle to Plato. I actually think that there isn't really any way through here that isn't Platonism. I think that the key here is an argument that Plato presents in the Republic and elsewhere, but let's just take the Republic briefly, where he's considering the structure of the soul, and he thinks these sort of tripartite construction of the psyche and so on, and we've got the governing part, and we've got the spirited part, and the appetitive part, and so on. So he's engaging in a kind of psychological analysis. And he thinks that for the good of the soul, that the governing part should be in charge, not the appetites, not the spirited part, but the governing part. Another question is, why should the governing part be in charge? And the answer is, it's because it's best. Another question is, why is it best? And the answer to that is because the objects with which it's concerned are the best. That the governing part, the intellectual part of the soul, is the best part of the soul, the highest part of the soul, because the things with which it deals are the best kind of things, the highest kind of things. And this is not an argument from conceptuality in the sense that we presented it earlier on or reviewed it earlier on. It's from something like the perfection of objects, as it were. And Plato, I think, has an insight that we have a power to engage with the best of things, and that we have a sort of anyway, whatever that is. And that we sort of feel ourselves called all the time to the better. Now, I think that this is indeed an intimation of something non-material in us, but it's something that is, as it were, of the same kind as the best kind of things. And I think that the thing that is the same kind as the best kind of things is a kind of spiritual being. So I think we need to think again, and this is maybe a little uncomfortable for Thomas to do, we need to be a little less Aristotelian and a little bit more Platonistic. Now, it's a travesty, I'm going to stop now, it's a travesty to represent Plato as if he was a Cartesian. In fact, it's probably a travesty to represent Descartes as if he was a Cartesian. I mean, it's part of the sort of, shorthand, sort of 101 level philosophy to represent Descartes as if he was some sort of irredeemable idiot, that he's nobody who reads Descartes could not fail to be struck by the fact that Descartes struggles. Some people have introduced, even termed his view trialism, not dualism, but trialism, that he thinks there's three kinds of things. There are spiritual beings, angels, there are material beings, and then there are human beings, and human beings are a third kind of thing. In many respects, Descartes, when he comes to that question, is much closer to Thomas. He and Thomas are struggling in the same way. And I think it's cheap and unrewarding to represent Descartes as if he's an idiot, and it's even worse to represent Plato as if he were a Cartesian. So I think we need to go back to Plato. I think that in trying to sort of work our way through to this, I think insofar as the people in this room may be Catholics, then I think we are doctrinally committed to a separable soul. And insofar as philosophy pursues the course of non-materialism, I think it's going to take us in the direction of a separable soul. I think that what Thomas has to say about these matters isn't persuasive at the end of the day. I think he struggles, and I think that's evident. It's not a criticism. These are very difficult matters. So let me turn finally to Thomas's second thoughts. Not his first thoughts, but his second thoughts. And these are drawn from the commentary on 1 Corinthians and also later on in the Summa. So the 1 Corinthians bit that I'm going to quote is fairly familiar. It's just this: the human being naturally desires his well-being, but the soul, since it's part of the human body, is not the whole human being, and I am not my soul. And then we've got the Latin there and so on. We can feel Thomas struggling with the idea of the separable soul as being a person. But I actually want to turn finally to his remarks later on in the Secunda Secundae. We must judge differently, he says, the knowledge itself of truth and the desire and study in the pursuit of the knowledge of truth. For the knowledge of truth, strictly speaking, is good, but it may be bad accidentally, per accidens, by reasons of some result. And he gives 4 considerations, but here's one he's going to lead into. On the other hand, the desire or study in pursuing the knowledge of truth may be right or wrong. When a man studies to know the truth above the capacity of his own intelligence, since by so doing men easily fall into error. Wherefore it is written, seek not the things that are too high for thee, and search not into things above thy ability, and in many of his works be not curious. And further on, for the suspicion of them hath deceived many, and hath detained their minds in vanity. So my conclusion really is the possibility of embracing skepticism. What I mean by that is, or if you like in another way, Mysterianism. This is a matter that may have no intellectual resolution. That it may simply be the case that we cannot work our way through to a coherent account of these matters. And I think that philosophy, at least its practice in my parts of the world, I have in mind St. Andrews rather than Baylor in this respect, is not noted for its humility. Right? I mean, we just keep going. There's nothing that can resist the power of this intellectual activity and so on. But it may be the better part of wisdom here to recognize that actually philosophy is a limited activity. It can get us so far, but it may not be able to get us beyond that. And at that point, indeed, I think we may need to turn to faith and here just simply embrace that which comes to us from the apostles, the deposit of the faith, and the words of the creed. And on that note, I conclude. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, you have the moat, and it protects you from me and others. Anyway, thank you very much, Professor Haldane, for pointing out that philosophical proof can crumble away in our hands. I am, there are a lot of contemporary Catholic theologians who would like to say there is resurrection, okay, but who do not want to affirm what they think is fundamentally, whether you find it in Aquinas or anywhere else, a sort of Platonic notion. Yeah. But it seems to me that we're stuck with a kind of difficult conclusion here. What is the rational mind supposed to believe? If, in fact, there isn't anything immaterial that we can be sure of in the human soul, then what does God do at the final resurrection? He takes his magic wand and he goes zap, and we arise from the dust and are reconstituted. And I think I'd rather go with, a sort of, plausible argument for the existence of a separable immaterial soul than believe that God is simply going to, act like a magician. He didn't make us to live forever, but he can make us live forever because he's omnipotent. And I'm slightly uncomfortable with that kind of magician God, so I wonder what you have to say about that.
Well, one thing, of course, is that even if we thought that the arguments that Thomas presents and others have presented simply went through, unproblematically, they're not, of course, and of course Thomas himself says this, they're not actually proofs of the immortality of the soul. They're proofs of the non-natural mortality of the soul. But, of course, it's entirely possible for God to annihilate such souls and so on. So the question of our having a sort of eternal future is still going to call upon some divine role in that respect. I think that's one thing that's very important. I think, and I don't know whether this is what you had in mind, but I mean, for resurrectionists, there is a problem, of course, famously about the identity of the resurrected person. What makes it the case that the person who will rise again is one and the same as the person who was interred? And the additional difficulties of vaporized bodies and so on, just leave that to one side. I just mean in the ordinary case, even in the ordinary case of that. A field of bodies after a battle in which all the bits are intermingled in one thing and another. What makes it the case that one who rises is one and the same as one who fell? Now, Paul in 1 Corinthians, of course, thinks in a way he's got an answer to that, not as a philosophical question, but he says, you foolish men, you ask us, what body shall we be raised? Do you not know what is sown in dishonor is raised in glory? But the analogy that he uses, or the example that he uses, is that of the seed. Because the problem is that we know that what Paul thought about seeds isn't true, right? He thought that these seeds died, and then they come to the plant comes from the seed and so on. But I do think there is a question about identity, and one reason for having a separable soul as a kind of intermediary is as a carrier of identity. So what makes it the case that that resurrected body is one and the same as the person who lived before is that body is animated by one and the same soul, which continued in the interim and so on. Now, I myself actually don't think that there is, metaphysically speaking, a big problem about gap-inclusive objects. So I think you can have objects that actually have gaps in their history. So I don't think it's decisive, the identity problem. For example, in Britain, and I'm sure here in the United States, you can buy sort of ready assembly furniture. And you can disassemble that stuff and store it away. Now, you can imagine a form of that in which, it actually sort of breaks down into very small parts and then is reassembled in one thing and another. I think nobody would be inclined to say that's not the same wardrobe as you had before, simply because there was a period in which the wardrobe didn't exist in the interim, even though the particles did and so on. So gap-inclusive objects don't, as such, trouble me, but I do think that there is a question, or a set of questions, actually, around this. So in that respect, I do agree. Funnily enough, I think if you follow the route that I'm sort of find myself passing down, the resurrection becomes, there could, at the end of the day, it's a very interesting question, this, since many advocates of resurrectionism, when you press them on this, actually have a notion of what resurrection might involve that is going to take you away from a kind of literalist picture of just the graves opening up and bodies coming up and so on. So, Paul says, it answers the question, with what body shall we be raised? And he uses the phrase soma pneumaticon, a spiritual body or a spiritualized body. And you feel, if you were in a philosophy seminar, you'd grab him by the throat and say, look, spiritual or body, right? And you can see what he's got. But, if you can interpret Paul there in a direction that's going to spiritualize the body, in which case it's not so clear what the difference is between a bodily resurrection and a continuing spiritual existence or a transformation. And after all, of course, the image of Christ after Easter Sunday is one in which, the materiality of Christ is sort of, let's just say, non-standard. So there are these sort of interesting questions as to at the end of the day, what's attached to an idea of bodily resurrection and so on. So that's not really an answer, but it's just a comment on what you said. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Haldane, for your presentation. I have a two-part question. First of all, it seems that you implied, and maybe I was profoundly misunderstanding you, but that you implied that it's a sort of fundamental principle of analytic philosophy that there are no such thing as self-evident propositions.
Yeah.
And that if that is the case, then how is it that we begin anywhere in our process of reasoning?
Is that part one or is that part two?
Part one is whether or not there are self-evident propositions.
This is not to do with analytical philosophy. This is to do with truth. I think there are no self-evident propositions. That is to say, I think there is no statement or proposition that is not amenable to rejection if one's willing to make enough adjustments elsewhere. This is not going to be terrible, but Thomas, for example, when he tries to find examples of self-evident, mind you, look, already with Thomas, we get a little bit of equivocation here, even in Thomas. Because if you remember, he distinguishes between propositions self-evident in themselves and propositions self-evident to us. Right, now here's my first task. Write an essay on the nature of that distinction. What exactly does that mean, the distinction between propositions self-evident in themselves? Self-evidence is a relational term. Or it has this implication, as it were, evident to who, right? What would it be for a proposition simply to be intrinsically self-evident? I'm not saying there isn't an answer to that, but I'm trying to say even Thomas finds it necessary when it comes to self-evidence to make a distinction here. The second thing is this, or rather, let me just move to what you said as the starting point. It's interesting in this. So, for example, in Aristotle draws a parallel. In fact, I would say it's more than a parallel. I'd say it's an identity. But anyway, let's not get into the detail of that. His conception between two things, between concept formation and the acquisition of first principles. So in Aristotle, for example, strictly speaking, a science is a deductive system, right, in which you proceed from axioms, first principles, deductively to certain conclusions concerning them. So in Aristotelian science, in our science, we proceed from effects to causes. But in Aristotelian science, you proceed from causes to effects. So you say what happens on the basis of an understanding of the causes that are involved, or the natures of the things that are involved, okay? So here's the question: how do we understand the natures of things? Right? What's the nature of that knowledge of first principles? Now, Aristotle connects that with his account of concept formation, which is, in other words, where do we get concepts from, if you like? And he believes in not mathematical induction, which is the modern notion, but abstractive induction or abduction. In other words, he thinks we've got insight, a kind of insight into the natures of things. And we could talk a bit about that and so on. Now, I think what I want to say, or what I'm just going to assert now, is that there is no infallible abduction. Abduction is an interpretation. I believe in abduction. I believe in Aristotelian abstractive induction, but I think it's an interpretation. And again, I'll just return to one thing that I think is a simply irreversible result in modern philosophy is the underdetermination of theory by evidence. There's just no going back on that. We just know that any set of evidence is compatible with different theories of that evidence. I just think this is, these are not, as it were, I'd put these beyond contested theories. I think these are just genuine, this is the acquisition of knowledge. The growth of knowledge tells us that any set of data is compatible with different theories of that data. right? I mean, we know this in a sense. We knew this already in the challenge to the sort of epicycles in the movement of the planets and such like. Sure, you can construct a theory. I mean, you can still construct a theory that will explain the phenomena by positing the Earth as the center of the universe. If you're willing to make enough adjustments, right, you can do it. You can square it. You know, I mean, it's still wildly implausible. It's not worth bothering about. But nonetheless, you know, you can square the observational data and such like. The question is, what's plausible? And so I think that, you know, the Aristotelian scheme is that, you know, where do we get our first principles from? Well, we get our first principles from reflecting on experience. But that's not a kind of superpower that's just going to go woof, you know, straight in there and then there's no question about it. So, you know, one of Thomas's examples, for example, of a self-evident principle is that no part is of the same size as the whole of which it is a part, right? Well, sorry, you know, but sets that have infinite sets as their members, you know, I mean, these sort of principles, you know, we just recognize that concepts are amenable to, concepts have their place within a network of theoretical judgments and claims and so on. And the question about what resolves or might resolve the adequacy of one theory over another is not the data, but something else, right? I mean, there's a whole set of other things. But what I'll just call plausibility in the light of total reflection. And that's a struggle. That's a big enterprise, right? And that kind of holism means that we have to be humble in the face of something that might come along tomorrow. I don't mean an event, but a set of ideas and so on that might require us to make adjustments in the light of this growing total reflection. And just to make it clear, by the way, because I think some people might feel slightly scandalized by what I said earlier, just let me make it clear. When I said there are reasonable arguments for same-sex marriage, there are reasonable arguments for abortion, what I mean by that is I'm not kind of applauding those arguments. I'm just saying that if you think that you can show that your opponents on those issues can just be defeated because they simply missed the point when you said that life begins at conception, that's not the case, right? I mean, we've got to give an account of what we mean by life, what we mean by conception, and understanding of our way in which we engage with the human and so on. It's a much bigger story now. It's just the days of demonstration are over. There aren't going to be any demonstrations anymore. I mean, there never were any, but there just aren't going to be any anymore. In geometry, in logic, even in logic, there are non-standard logics and so on. There just aren't going to be any demonstrations anymore. It's not easy for anyone now. We just carry the burdens of human fallibility and the human condition, and we have to try to make our arguments in the light of the totality of experience and reflection upon that experience. Yes?
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the resurrection.
Forward to the resurrection, surely.
The resurrection. I wonder if, I mean, the fact that at the resurrection there's a judgment, doesn't that change things a bit? The IKEA furniture doesn't hold, and I guess it relates to the agent body problem. That if God's going to either recreate this new thing, and he's going to have to recreate it with its sins if it's going to be condemned or whatever, or there has to be some bearer of responsibility from the death to the resurrection, or is there some way around that?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, this, by the way, he's not fully credited with this, I mean, in the general accounts of him, but this was one of John Locke's motivations in the development of his notion of person as a forensic notion. Locke thought we needed to distinguish between bodies, quantities of matter, living things, and persons. So in the case of a human being, you've got the stuff of which the human being is composed, you've got the human animal, and then you've got this third thing, or third aspect, or whatever you want to call it, which is the person. Now, he thought that we needed to introduce that notion, which he thought was a forensic notion. It was a sort of kind of notion that might feature in criminal law, or at least in, or tort, or whatever it is, the idea of somebody who was responsible for something. And Locke actually, in his discussions on this, precisely is motivated, at least in part, by his concerns about the resurrection. Quite interesting discussions in Locke that are just generally not looked at. And he's precisely concerned with the question of holding responsible come the resurrection. And so he's struggling with this idea that do you hold a body responsible? Do you hold an animal responsible? Or do you hold a person responsible? Well, if you hold a person responsible, we're dealing with the kind of something that's in the framework of a moral being or something of that sort. So I mean, I don't know if this is quite engaging with what you're saying, but I think that a notion of bodily resurrection that is just focused on the metaphysics of the identity of a living organism doesn't begin to match these, or falls far short of an account of, if you like, the moral theology or the eschatology, I suppose. The eschatology of resurrection. So I mean, I don't have an easy answer to this, but I'm sort of acknowledging, I think what you're saying. We're not just, so the metaphysics of gap-inclusive objects, for example, that I was suggesting, isn't just kind of falls far short of that which we're concerned with here, insofar as judgment is concerned, which is something that is to be held responsible, not by God deeming them responsible, but they're actually being responsible. Yeah, I agree.